Hey everyone, it's Ulysses from Snapkeep Videos, and I'm back today with another video about Modern. And today's video is going to be focused on the new big baddie of Modern, the brand new variant of Bridgevine. These decks do not die, they merely evolve. Sometimes they lie dormant until an MTG innovator like myself or like you picks up the deck, brews it brand new altogether, or finds the missing piece via a new set or a reprint that makes it legal in Modern or something like that. Now, because of the printing of Modern Horizons, the Bridgevine deck got a couple upgrades. 2 cards that were printed from Legacy into Modern, Carrion Feeder and Altar of Dementia, along with a brand new card, the card that the new variant gets its name from, HOGAAK Arisen Necropolis. 5 generic, double black or double green, 8/8 creature with trample, and it says you can't spend mana to cast this card. It also has Convoke and Delve, with more text that says you may cast HOGAAK Arisen Necropolis from your graveyard. Now, Carrion Feeder, similar to Viscera Seer, is a 1/1 creature for 1 black mana that is a free sack outlet. The only difference is it can't block, and when you sacrifice a creature, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. So instead of being able to scry 1, you just get a really big creature really quickly with the help of Bloodghast and Gravecrawler. Now, Altar of Dementia is very similar to Altar of the Brood, except instead of it being whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, whenever you sacrifice a creature, target player puts the top cards of their library equal to the sacrificed creature's power. So if you sacrifice a Bloodghast, they mill 2. Now you can target yourself. That's why that card's very important, because you don't have to have an ETB for it to go off. You mill yourself until you hit cards like HOGAAK or your Bloodghast or your Gravecrawler, and then it just synergizes with what HOGAAK's trying to do, which is be cast from the graveyard. Just because the deck is strong doesn't mean it's unbeatable. In this video, I'm going to talk about 5 cards that I feel are going to be really hard for this deck to overcome, and they are probably going to have to respect these 5 cards. Like most decks that run off the graveyard, this Bridgevine HOGAAK deck is pretty soft to graveyard hate. So if you have some really good graveyard hate cards like Leyline of the Void or Grafdigger's Cage, this deck struggles with that. So their sideboard is going to be equipped to battle these graveyard hate decks from our sideboard and sometimes in our main board. Is It Phoenix is one of those decks that has caused people to play Surgical Extraction in the main board. So I'm going to talk about 5 cards that are not the traditional graveyard hate that these decks fear. And maybe these cards will help certain archetypes be better off against this HOGAAK deck, and maybe even shut it down and push it out of the meta again. So without further ado, I'm going to go naming off these cards and tell you why I think they will help against this HOGAAK Bridgevine strategy. The first card is a human soldier from Ravnica Allegiance, and that is Lavinia Azorius Renegade. It is a 2-drop 2/2 creature that is 1 white 1 blue, and it reads, each opponent can't cast non-creature spells with converted mana cost greater than the number of lands that player controls. Now, that ability doesn't really apply as much to combating this HOGAAK deck as much as the second part of the ability, which is whenever an opponent casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. Now, this pertains to the HOGAAK deck because of the card HOGAAK. It's definitely hard to play a spell that reads it cannot be cast using mana, and having an ability like Lavinia's that says if an opponent casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. So it pretty much locks HOGAAK out of the game. You have to remove Lavinia from the battlefield in order for HOGAAK to enter the battlefield. So it's pretty self-explanatory why Lavinia is a good card to use to combat against HOGAAK. And being a human, humans might even benefit from using her. Moving on, the next card I think that HOGAAK will have a problem combating against is a card called Yixlid Jailer. Now, this card's from Future Sight. It's a zombie wizard, and it's 1 black 1 generic, a 2/1, and its ability is cards in graveyards lose all abilities. Now, the reason why this card's particular in this deck is because of the card Bridge from Below. Now, that was one of the cards that made the original Bridgevine deck so good and so consistent and so powerful and so synergistic, and all these words that make a deck. So what Bridge from Below did was, it didn't matter if your opponent wiped your board or dealt with your creatures. Bridge from Below being in your graveyard caused you to just make a bunch of zombies. So this card eliminating that ability and all other abilities of cards like Gravecrawler and Bloodghast and even HOGAAK. But the fact that this interacts with Bridge from Below was one of those cards that was very hard to interact, because most cards in the game of Magic, when they say that they shut off cards in graveyards, it's usually creatures. I'm not really familiar with many cards that deal with enchantments that work off the graveyard. Bridge from Below is pretty unique in that regard. So this Jailer card was perfect for that. The next card that will combat this HOGAAK deck is Kaya Orzhov Usurper. Now that's the 3-drop Planeswalker from Ravnica Allegiance, and she is awesome. She's great against Izzet Phoenix and other graveyard strategies, so this HOGAAK deck is going to have to look out for her too. Her abilities are great against this HOGAAK deck. The first one is exile up to 2 target cards from a single graveyard. You gain 2 life if at least 1 creature was exiled this way. Now this HOGAAK deck is pretty much all creatures, so it's a win-win. The life buffer may or may not be relevant, but the fact that it says a single graveyard, not target graveyard, gets around any kind of leyline effects that HOGAAK might use if that comes up. This totally trumps that. And the cards are exiled. So if you get a Gravecrawler or a Bloodghast, those cards are exiled. They can never be used again. So that is really relevant. Her second ability is also relevant. It's a -1, and it's exile target non-land permanent with converted mana cost 1 or less. Now again, a lot of these HOGAAK cards are 1 mana. Faithless Looting, Gravecrawler, the Stitcher Supplier, Insolent Neonate, and Necrotic Wound is their form of removal, so they can't cast that. Oh, and also this Carrion Feeder. Carrion Feeder is a card that is modern legal now because of Modern Horizons. It's one of the other cards that the deck has access to feed its engine, and you can't cast that either because it's 1 mana. So I think Kaya will definitely be a thorn in HOGAAK's side moving forward. Now the last 2 cards that I'd like to talk today about being good against HOGAAK are cards that are not new to Modern. These cards have existed in many different strategies and have kind of like an unconventional way, I guess, of dealing with HOGAAK. One, not so much as the other, but we'll get to it. The first card is Chalice of the Void. Now, Chalice of the Void has always been a hate card in Modern. It's been a prison staple, so you guys know a lot about Chalice. I don't have to break that card down so much. But in this deck, again, it's a really big deal because most of the cards that feed this HOGAAK engine are 1 mana. So if you land a Chalice on 1, it's backbreaking. They have to respect that card, otherwise they can't play Magic. So that's why I picked Chalice of the Void on this list. And the last card is Emrakul the Aeon's Torn. Is no stranger to Modern. There's been decks to cheat her into play. There's been decks that have made enough mana to cast her right out from your hand. So Emrakul is well known in the game of Magic and in the game of Modern especially. But in this deck, one of HOGAAK's win conditions is to mill their opponent out. So if you have Emrakul in your deck, it's almost like when people played Lantern Control. They had to respect the fact that you had Emrakul. And if their game plan was to mill you out, Emrakul just resets that. Because as soon as she gets put in the graveyard, her trigger goes on the stack, and it forces your opponent has very little ways of interacting with that trigger unless they have some sort of exile effect or something like that. Because it makes you shuffle your graveyard back to your library. So it resets their whole mill you out plan. So that's something to think about. Now, if you guys have any strategies on how to combat this HOGAAK deck, feel free to leave a comment below. I just wanted to make this quick video just because it's something that's come up in the last 2 days or so. A lot of my friends and my fellow teammates on the G&G Elite have talked about this HOGAAK deck and how it's a real thing. And even if it lasts only a few months or so, like its predecessor, I think it's here to stay for the meantime, and you need to, at the very least, know how to play against it. If it's not your playstyle, that's fine, but you will run into this deck, and knowing how to play against it is huge. And for those of you who want to play with HOGAAK, knowing how to play against the mirror match or knowing what players are going to be using to combat your strategy is very important. So hopefully these 5 cards have helped shed some light on this HOGAAK tyrant. And don't forget that playing Rest in Peace, playing Leyline of the Void, and playing Grafdigger's Cage, those cards are still 100% viable. I'm not saying not to use those cards. It's just if you want something a little more, if your strategy can cater to some of these creatures because of the tribal essence, like humans with Lavinia, for example, then that's why I chose to talk about these cards today. But if you guys have any different opinions, please feel free to leave them down below. I'm always eager to hear what you guys think. And I want to thank you guys again for joining me, and I will see you guys in the next video. Take it easy.